Preparing to live stream.
Yeah, this is James.
Well,
FYI.
So you'll see that there's a lag.
Is it okay if I change the name on the Zoom stream to ASL interpreter on this Zoom? Right now it has Laura listed.
It is still.
Okay, all right.
James, how do I see the Zoom that's live and not the?
Let's just close this. Can we close? No, let's not do that. That seems.
It must be open behind.
It's down here.
The most regular there is that, if you move what we're paying attention to, you know, not looking at it, so that
All right.
yeah.
Everyone in YouTube land, we're going to get started in just a moment, but we're setting up the live stream and getting our ASL interpreter set up on the camera. So give us just a moment. Okay.
Just make sure we're good on.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone in real life. Thank you for coming out to our third Queer of Color, Trans of Color conversation. We began this series this semester and it has been a success so far, and that is in part and most part due to people who show up during spring break. And thank you to everyone who is in YouTube land. We are live streaming onto the CLAGS YouTube channel. Welcome. I am Laura Westengard. I am the co-chair of the board of directors of CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I just want to give you a brief overview of CLAGS quickly and to do our donation pitch, because we depend on folks like you who show up to our free programming to make the free programming continue to run. So CLAGS was founded in 1991 as the first university-based research center in the United States dedicated to the historical, cultural, and political issues of vital concern to LGBTQ individuals and communities. CLAGS nurtures cutting-edge scholarships, such as the scholarship that we're going to be hearing about today from our guest, Nick Flores. And it organizes and co-sponsors events for examining and affirming LGBTQ lives and fosters network building among academics, artists, activists, policymakers, and community members. CLAGS stands committed to maintaining a broad program of public events, online projects, and fellowships that promote reflection on queer pasts, presents, and futures. But we can't do it without you. Your support to CLAGS is critical to establishing a legacy dedicated to the study of LGBTQ+ historical, cultural, and political issues. So please consider clicking on the link in the chat and making a donation to CLAGS tonight. And for those of you in the room, we have an old-fashioned cardboard box to accept your cash. We also have a QR code if you would prefer to donate online. Yeah, well, when we finish those waters, we'll pass the basket. Whether your gift is $10, $100, or $1,000, it has significant impact on the lives of students and our community, both now and in the future. So again, I invite you to click the link in the chat, which we will drop now and at the end of the program. And I'm going to turn this over to my board co-chair, James Harris, to introduce our guest today.
Chaos, absolute chaos. Apologies. Coming in. Nick's a friend. This whole series has been an embarrassment of riches, and I mean that. We had a little dream, and it was that we wanted to have a conversation about what is queer of color studies, what does it mean as a methodology, how does it matter in the world, where does it show up, to whom does it matter, and what does it do in their work? And we kind of wrote a dream list, right? We said, okay, if we could have all our favorite people, who would it be? And I mean, so far we're batting 1,000 and bad at sports. Is that right? I think we just every single month, it's a thinker that I'm so deeply excited to share the space with. It's a collection of ideas that I just can't stop thinking about. And this month is no exception. But also this month is a good friend of mine. And so Nick Flores gave me this bio, and I'm going to read it because I love and respect him. Nick Flores is a queer Latinx writer and transdisciplinary scholar whose research explores the relationship between the HIV prevention medication known as PrEP and its effects on Black and Latinx communities in the United States. He specializes in public and sexual health, HIV/AIDS prevention, ethnography, and gender and sexuality studies, with additional interests in queer of color critique, disability studies, and feminist science and technology studies. In 2020, Nick began as an assistant professor in the Department of Latino and Latino Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. In addition to several journal article preparations, Nick has contributed book chapters to edited collections, including Communicating Intimate Health from Lexington Books. Rutgers University Press has recently published A Pill for Promiscuity, Gay Sex in the Age of Pharmaceuticals. He's currently working on a book manuscript titled Becoming HIV Negative, under contract with the University of Minnesota Press. His commitments to health equity and racial justice have allowed him to share his work across a range of audiences, including medical professionals who provide direct services, policymakers at local and state levels, and community-based organizations through educational workshops and continuing education efforts. Nick received the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation's Humanities Release Time Award and Funding Initiative for Multiracial Democracy Manuscript Award for the fall 2022 semester to support his writing and research. For the 2022-2024 academic years, Nick was named a Lincoln Excellence Fellow for Assistant Professors, LEAP Scholar, by the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He also co-hosts a podcast, Learning on the Job, with James Harris. You may have heard of him before, and the annual Writing in Depth academic writing retreat at Hope Springs Institute in Ohio. I love him, and I'm so excited to hear his thoughts. Nick, tell us what you got.
Thank you, James, and thank you everyone for being here. But before we proceed, there's a lot of energy. And I would love nothing more if we could collectively maybe take a deep breath together. So on 3, 1, 2, 3, in through the nose. And exhale. One more on 3, 1, 2, 3. And exhale. Thank you. This is Nick Flores speaking. I want to thank James Harris, my dear friend, Laura, Donna, Fernando, and the CLAGS board for beginning this urgent and necessary series, and also for letting me contribute. Thank you to all those who showed up in person and for everyone joining us virtually. Today, I'm going to share parts of the book chapter from the recently published A Pill for Promiscuity, Gay Sex in the Age of Pharmaceuticals out of Rutgers University Press. I also encourage you to check that out. HIV prevention occurs beyond testing sites, regular medical checkups, and prescription pickups. Prevention practices occur at the bus stop, at the bar, on the dance floor, news programming, and especially on hookup apps. Ideally, fucking should be stress-free, fun, consensual, and above all else, pleasurable for everyone involved. When we consider the contemporary arrangements and energies around sex and bareback fucking among gay, cis male, and queer communities in particular, we notice that something is happening. In dominant modes of medical and public health discourses, sex is unwittingly relegated to the side of either respectability or promiscuity. Both ends of the spectrum illuminate how the various boundaries around fucking, that is, how it is felt, who is doing it, and what pleasures are derived from it, reveal it as a socially dynamic and emergent activity. So keeping this in mind, my interest here is in the lessons to be learned and unlearned about how we come to fuck while on PrEP in the world today. I also should have mentioned that this piece is called Learning How to Fuck on PrEP. The title of this contribution enters the ongoing conversations about the implementation and uptake of the biomedical intervention known as pre-exposure prophylaxis, PrEP, amongst Black and Brown communities here in the United States. Introduced to the US market in 2012, over a decade now, the once-a-day pill is utilized alongside antiretroviral medications, ARVs, to reduce viral suppression and to curb transmission rates among HIV-negative people. Here in this chapter, I'm drawing on my second year of field work from approximately 2017 to 2018, where I focused my ethnographic research on 11 PrEP users to better understand how racial, ethnic, and sexual subjectivities were being negotiated by people consuming the drug. I experienced and engaged the city of Columbus, Ohio, where I conducted the fieldwork during this time through networks of mostly Black and Latinx self-identified gay and queer men whose struggles I shared, learned from, and helped where I could. During the previous year, while conducting fieldwork with the community-based health organization, I was educated in the conceptualization, the design, the implementation, and the administration of HIV prevention at the community-based level, while also being schooled in the challenges my peers faced and with the spaces of sociality made available to them in a Midwestern city. Far from presenting PrEP as an uncritical linear point of progress in the traumatic history of HIV/AIDS, however, I understand the pill and its effects as a continuity of both sexual racism and structural vulnerability. The colors of HIV prevention in the United States are Black and brown. Black and brown gay and queer men's sexual encounters and, quote, high-risk sex is increasingly the main topic of concern in HIV prevention in both public health discourses and popular cultures. Many who laud the arrival of PrEP say it offers chances to explore sexual interests, intimacies, and pleasures through sex acts that have accrued forbidden and taboo meanings since the 1980s and 1990s, condomless sex. However, the double-edged sword of the virus's disproportionate impact on Black and Latinx communities reveals the contradictions within these logics and discourses. So on the one hand, the body of information about gay sex vilifies certain acts like bareback sex, and especially those who engage in it. On the other hand, those bodies that are disproportionately higher in rates of transmission also fall along racial, ethnic, and class lines, Black and brown bodies. So put another way, the epidemiological knowledge is produced about and around HIV's disproportionate effects among minoritized community castigate sexual acts deemed high risk without fuller understanding of the structural complexities at play, including, but not limited to, financial obligations and accessibility, healthcare coverage, stigma, shame, and medical mistrust, to name a few. Here, I'm thinking with and from Marlon Bailey, who writes that HIV prevention research and services concerning Black gay men, and here I would add Latinx gay men, must develop approaches that are appropriate, practical, realistic, effective, and most important, pleasure and sex affirming. This section of the chapter is entitled Getting and Giving a PrEP Education. Elias, a pseudonym. Elias is a late 20-something self-identified Latinx cis male, young professional living in Central Ohio, and at the time of our interview was 1 year on PrEP. And he tells me during an interview, quote, "His face looked so confused when I explained how PrEP worked," end quote. The quick hookup Elias had hoped for on his lunch break before heading back to work was interrupted by what he considered an unnecessary explanation. Elias continues, quote, "I mean, I had to tell them that we didn't need to use a condom since I was on PrEP and that it prevented HIV. Even though he was confused and initially reluctant, we eventually fucked raw. It was hot and worth the brief explanation," end quote. I was curious about how Elias felt about having to explain to his casual hookup this scene. Upon reflecting further, Elias concluded, quote, "Honestly, it was kind of strange that I had to explain this to a white guy. I don't normally hook up with white dudes. I feel like PrEP is a thing that white gays know more about. At least that's been my experience here in Columbus. Not a lot of men of color to choose from. But hey, at least I got back to work on time," end quote. Not only was Elias in the position of knower, that is, someone explaining how PrEP worked in this encounter, but also the knowledge producer through the sex act itself. As we wrapped up the interview, I reflected on the broader systemic implications and the multiple scales through which this particular encounter, this ethnographic vignette, was conditioned and experienced. On the one hand, there are, for one, misunderstandings about HIV prevention, the desire for bareback sex, and communication about how encounters are negotiated in intimate spaces in real time. Some questions emerged. How did Elias and others come to their understandings about bareback sex once on PrEP? In what ways do our social positions and situatedness inform how we communicate about PrEP to sex partners and then engage in sex acts? What types of relations are being forged through the use of biomedical interventions like PrEP? And in keeping with the previous question, what types of social relations are eclipsed through bareback pleasure seeking among racially and sexually minoritized subjects? Elias's encounter, that is, a quick fuck with an educational moment, was not his first foray into clarifying PrEP significant to his casual partner that he explained then, among others. Indeed, others that I'd interviewed had similar experiences in describing the newfound role of PrEP in their lives and the chance to experience condomless sex, mostly carefree. The terms of Elias's meeting, his recollection, and his translation of the scene aligned with others' stories about how they would take on the simultaneous role of sex educator and pleasure seeker. This next section is entitled Unlearning PrEP's Whiteness. Whiteness is not only social context and ubiquitous common, but also a social logic that produces and substantiates unequal social relations, a discourse made material through PrEP's unequal distribution, prescription numbers, and consumption by certain racialized bodies. Don't believe me? Ask your friends who and who is not on PrEP. It is precisely through the seen and knowable whiteness that Black and brown PrEP users are able to mark whiteness's presence as a social force in their world. The process of racialization that follows PrEP's uptake accentuates what scholar George Lipsitz has referred to as the possessive investment in whiteness. For Lipsitz, social life is figured as, quote, the sum total of conscious and deliberative individual activities, which cloaks racist activity as individual manifestations of personal prejudice and hostility, end quote. By maintaining social arrangements where individuals and their activities remain the locus of political activity, Lipsitz also argues that, quote, systemic, collective, and coordinated group behavior consequently drops out of sight, end quote. The weight placed on individuality reifies both by validating openly and through tacit acceptance, an investment in whiteness as a social, structural, and health-related advantage. So to rephrase, the colors of HIV prevention in the United States are Black and brown, but the implementation of health services upholds white supremacist orders. So now from unlearning and relearning to healing. The process of learning is equally about unlearning and then relearning. Elias's interview and his description of the scene about educating a sexual partner about PrEP and the implication it had on his encounter show how the lessons and fucking among Black and brown communities differ from their white counterparts. PrEP's racial dimensions and ethnic entanglements shape and are shaped by the context out of which the drug is socially produced and culturally conditioned. Specifically, PrEP is produced between the racial and ethnic frames of logic, medicalized speak, and bodies who ingest the drug, even if these various points of contact do not fully explain why and how the drug remains inaccessible for its intended Black and brown users. Elias's encounter and my brief analysis is not meant to stand in for as hard evidence for which we can fully understand the messiness of sex today in an age of PrEP, but rather his brief interview and my analysis illustrate those various assumptive logics and lessons about fucking and about the fucking we think we're doing now in the age of PrEP. So for better or for worse, learning how to fuck on PrEP means facing shame, stigma, personal responsibility, and sexual racism, and having the audacity to name it and hopefully potentially change it. So PrEP has not only enabled certain forms of bodily arrangements through sex acts, but it has also offered new possibilities for shared intimacy and pleasure across difference. Now is the time to maybe pause, reflect, and interrogate the transformations that HIV prevention, and sex education have undergone and that are currently unfolding. It's time to learn how to fuck on PrEP.
I'm going to sit with the words for a minute because I have a trillion thoughts. And I will open the floor to questions from other people who might have them. But of course, as is my purview, I would love to ask the first question. It's the one we've been asking everybody, which is just like the invite from our end was, help us understand queer of color studies, trans of color studies. Help us map out how this shows up in your work, how it's useful as a methodology. In what way is this what you're doing?
Thank you for your question, James. Queer of color critique analysis is an invitation, is a confluence, is a convergence, is a, for me right now, a verbal processing. And without relying on citational practices of naming who is associated with queer of color critique, I think for me, it is as I started, an invitation to enter the conversation that brings to bear and centers experiences of queer of color people in a history of HIV/AIDS that has kind of ever been present through structural racism, through violence, since HIV/AIDS has been on the scene. And we should recall that part of the earlier work of queer color analysis, as kind of routed through women of color feminism of the 80s, was also a response to the AIDS epidemic at the time. And then its formal, the kind of formalization of queer of color critique or analysis is a part of this historical trajectory that we bring into the present that I think is also tied inextricably and tethered to HIV/AIDS. So for me, it's not about an arrival point, mapping on, so taking queer color analysis and putting it on, mapping it on to something, but rather letting the methods that I employ, which are ethnographic primarily, emerge in conversation with scholarship around queer of color folks who are pointing us to the structural, right?
I think that's a beautiful answer. I have more questions, but I won't be selfish. Room. Does anyone have it? And so maybe this is a second for us to make sure that Fernando is ready. Hello and welcome, friend. So that we can throw some questions out from the room if anyone has them. Yes, half a second to be set up, time in which I will not do the Jeopardy theme song, because I think we might get DMCA struck.
One of the things that, while people are sitting with thoughts that this piece didn't get to, but that I write about elsewhere, is the backdrop of the pharmaceutical industry, which is also about global economies that are profitable for people, or that profit on people who have HIV, right? That it is actually an industry in global reach, and that the backdrop of what I was describing in this short piece was also this fact, right? And part of what queer of color analysis, trans of color scholarship has pointed toward, and I'm thinking here in particular about the distribution of crisis, another recent collection on the global reaches of HIV/AIDS, of which one of the contributors is here with us today. Yeah, taking seriously the global reach of kind of racial capital, right? And the profiteering of pharmaceutical companies, and more recently, and I didn't get a chance to check out the memo, but the recent case in Texas for doing away with PrEP for insurance.
Well, I think we have a question. So let's try out our new question format. Let's just see what happens. I think you're gonna, if you wouldn't mind asking a question to an iPhone.
If you have a question, you can just let me know and I will point the camera at you. If you don't mind.
I'm not on camera.
Yes, you are, David.
And I think what you just said kind of led to my question, mainly because, okay, I'm telling my students about all the anti-woke laws and all the anti-LGBT laws, and they're asking real big. So I'm teaching multicultural counseling this semester, and a lot of my students are wondering what all these anti-Black, brown, queer, trans laws are going to mean for us when they get out in the field. My students are trained to be licensed counselors in mental addiction settings. And wondering, what does it mean for them for practice? And one who wants to move to Florida when she's done. And then what does it mean for my students who want to go into doctoral programs in places like Florida, Texas, all the other places where most of our really good counselor ed programs are for that are training people to become professors. What does that mean for them when they want to utilize things like critical race theory, other methodologies that are based in oppressive identities for their research, and they want to research topics like these, and they have faculty that are scared to do it. Tenure faculty that are scared to talk about these things, and now they're scared to even entertain these methodologies and the subjects that they want to study to support people like us. So how does this fit into their mental health careers and academic careers and their advocacy, which is part of their ethical duty as counselors? Does that make sense?
While waiting for your work.
Thank you, David. And thank you for being here and sharing about the materialities of the uptick, the resurgence of anti-LGBT, anti-trans, anti-Black, anti-brown, a la immigration, so-called reform. That I think my initial impulse is to suggest that you being here is a way for us to collectively talk out loud, right? Like I don't have all of the answers, and I don't want to like suggest that I do. And there's a lot of knowledge in this room, and I would be happy to, I wouldn't be happy, I encourage us to also think and sit with this question about living through this current moment. I find my people, James is my people, but that doesn't address the concerns for people who will be professionals who are giving direct services to folks. Yeah, I mean, I'm not.
I guess maybe one way of reframing the question is to just think a bit about some of the work you have done in sort of talking to public health provider audiences. And I guess my question there is sort of like, well, what is the framing, right? What is the way in which this conversation shows up as a clinical practice question, right? Because it seems like what's interesting about the ethnography point for me is that this all feels like it's the thing that happens after the body shows up in the like medical space. And I guess I'm curious about sort of like, if you could do an intervention at that earlier stage, right? What does that look like?
Yeah, so thank you for the question, and I hope this reframing it in this way will hopefully offer some insight if I can be at all. So I have offered workshops and continuing education credits for medical students who are pursuing MDs, and part of their curriculum, and it varies from place to place, but part of the curriculum includes the idea of cultural competency, right? Which is this notion that if students are in some way informed by the bodies that will come into the room, and have some sense of where they're coming from, or maybe how to communicate in a way that isn't violent, right? In that setting, is a route that I think is becoming much more of a common occurrence. However, and this is where the intervention comes in, there's a burgeoning group of scholarship that is interested in structural competency, which then brings the conversation to, it's not just about the body and the bodies that come into the clinical space who are seeking direct services, but thinking at the structural level, do the communities and their backgrounds how are they getting to these appointments? Do they have coverage? Are they insured or underinsured? Do they have a place to live? Are they eating, right? Like very basic human need. And the notion of structural competency is one that I think some medical fields, and just kind of a general overview, is turning toward, that again, doesn't just simply rely on this notion of culture at a kind of face-to-face level, but thinking very at scale, right? Language that gets often used is this notion of health disparities, which is a way of talking about low income, poor people, disabled people, undocumented people, right? And so I think that it's important to shift that conversation, but then also pragmatically, the community-based health organization that I worked with, which was a federal lookalike healthcare system that delivered direct services, simple things like, does your intake form, rely on people producing documents for like citizenship? Does it rely on certain genders, right? Does it rely on producing, documents that would otherwise pragmatically for some not be available, but that they don't have, right? So I mean, there, at whatever scale we're talking, there are pragmatic but also informed structural instances where I think, that has to come into conversation.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Yes.
Can you give us 2 seconds to get, there we go, we're ready.
So it would be interesting if you look at your field notes to figure out if the same people who are the experts in teaching cultural competency, right, are also the experts in teaching structural competency, right? Because the structural competency sounds like it takes a professor to teach or somebody who has a sense of how structured work, right? But your field notes probably say the expert is the same person, right? Who teaches the cultural competencies.
Thank you for that question, Matt. So in my research and in my field notes, so the community-based health organization was one of the first to provide PrEP in the state. And in this instance, yes, it was the same person. So the organization hired from a grant by the pharmaceutical company Gilead to hire PrEP navigators, which is akin to patient navigators, which come directly out of the American Affordable Care Act, right? And the people that the organization hired were community members who understood where people who are coming into their clinic on a sliding scale or who don't have insurance are coming from. And so they were doing the double work, and there were two of them, doing the double work of offering the language, the experiences of the kind of under the banner of cultural, but also really pushing and pressing us to think about the systemic, the structural forces that were disincentivizing, but also disallowing people from even showing up to the clinical spaces to access PrEP in the first place. Additionally, the organization very strategically set up its space, its clinical spaces strategically throughout like the city to be more available to racial ethnic minorities in the city, right? But yes, going back to who is doing the kind of structural competency conversation, in the instance of my research, yes, it was the people doing that double work.
As well as teaching in the moment of sex.
In the moment of, right. And so this is it too. So I understand the folks, the PrEP users, the Black and white PrEP users were also doing this type of work at the level of that intimate encounter, right? That is for me, so PrEP is not it is a conversation about it's about sex, about pleasure, but it's also the conversation about accessibility. It's about, what the adage, if the adage of the early AIDS epidemic years was getting drugs into bodies, we're now living in a time where drugs are getting into bodies, but only certain bodies, certain racialized bodies, right? And so I think that is also a part of this conversation. And what does it mean that prescription rates and numbers are still reflecting disproportionate uptake in non-white communities?
Are we saying that there's replication of stigma, but it's happening in a sexual and ritualized way?
There's certain bodies that see more disease and therefore there's more awareness in certain communities versus other bodies such as white bodies that may have equal sort of exposure, but because these bodies are not experiencing the same kind of stigmatization, the awareness is less.
Can I get old school with you for 5 seconds? We did this last time. Can you repeat the question back to the microphone, just in case anybody maybe didn't hear it in the live stream? You, Nick.
Oh. The question. Thank you. The question, I didn't catch your name. Zisa, thank you, Zisa. So Zisa was asking about stigma within dehumanization.
You know, and and sort of who these medications and drugs are geared towards, who they're being marketed towards, right? It seems like, I just feel like it's happening, but in like a sexualized way. Is that what I'm like?
Yes, so in the developing, thank you, Zisa, yes.
So you gotta repeat the question back and then
May
you can
you
answer
repeat?
it. No, I'm a great friend.
They could hear.
Oh, perfect. All right. Can I make him do it anyway?
Yeah.
Yeah, no. Keep your friends close.
This stigmatization is marginalized.
I was, thank you, Zisa, yeah.
Teaching, all that stuff.
Right, so the question about stigma within racialized communities, but how it may be sexualized in, for instance, like marketing campaigns. So I actually do have a chapter in the manuscript where I look at ad campaigns that were produced in Columbus, Ohio in particular, which were actually desexualized, but had Black and brown bodies on them versus other campaigns like in New York City or Chicago, which is one that I was proximate to at that time, where they were more sexualized, like Black bodies are sexualized, brown bodies are sexualized, in a way that, for instance, the campaigns in Central Ohio were not. It was about making sure that we were being responsible and protecting ourselves, right? That it does, and it has, I think, emerged, or rather that the campaigns have, depending on whether it's on TV or if it's localized to the city where you're seeing them, right? There is either explicit or implicit sexualization happening. And certainly I think too, with the interviews that I've conducted, that Black and brown people on PrEP do see themselves as like, well, not as high risk, but already marked as having the virus, right? Or like having AIDS. So, and that was communicated through things like marketing campaigns.
So are you saying essentially there was a internalization of the campaigns, right? That seems to be what's happening.
Yes, and additionally, the campaign and campaign language can be effective. I mentioned very briefly kind of medicalized speech, but Elias in other part of interview explicitly talks about how he was using the language in ads that he was seeing to talk about PrEP with sexual partners, right? That was a way that, you know, protecting oneself or safe sex is sex with PrEP, right? And the implicit message there is that you don't need a condom, right?
Can I ask one last question?
Please.
I am not very, I am a non-binary woman who's dressed in today. I am not quite aware of like in terms of like the numbers in terms of population who are diagnosed with HIV or AIDS, but like to my understanding, in relation to population, POC Black people, BIPOC folks tend to have a higher rate in sort of in relation to their population. Is that correct? So like 13% of Black people, but like maybe like a large number of that percentage have been diagnosed with HIV or AIDS in comparison to the white population where it might be a smaller percentage. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is accurate. That was accurate in Columbus, Ohio. And currently that is the case for the American South, right? That there is research conducted at the kind of public health level that a lot of seroconversions, people becoming HIV positive, is happening in larger metropolitan areas, but also really highly in like the American South, which is, you know, part of what I am doing in the research too is really untangling, right? Like all of these ways that codes that use epidemiological language is also racially coded and sexually coded. And to disentangle and kind of talk about that they're oftentimes, and again, I'm thinking really a lot with like Marlon Bailey's work where we're wanting to center pleasure, right? Like for him and his scholarship, it's about like Black pleasure, joy, right? And recentering some of that, but recentering that as opposed to becoming just a statistic or a number, right? Who is high risk or who is always seen as a potential like carrier of HIV.
In your work, do you explore any holdovers from slavery?
Not directly,
Okay.
but that is worth pursuing, and I know that there are likely connections to be made there, certainly.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll start with a compliment, but you have to repeat it.
Thank you.
Congratulations to CLAGS, it sounds like we're having a multidisciplinary conversation. And that's amazing, like it's usually these conversations happen in narrow little rooms, and so congratulations to CLAGS. So can you repeat that one, James?
What I heard was James nailed it, and that is all.
And then my compliment for Nick is I love this thing that you did repeatedly is helping us see the people that are having to do the work, the Black and brown people who are having to do the work and who are not necessarily either collectively or even on an individual level getting to reap the benefits, right? It's like we see all these, like you say it twice, it's Black and brown young people having to do HIV work. They're the frontline worker in more ways than one, and then they or the people they know are the ones who maybe are not going to get good care or are becoming ill, right? So thanks for saying that at least twice. Some of that compliment.
I will
People
take
are-
that one as well, which was just that I think the work does a really masterful job of identifying sort of like the ways in which there are specific communities that are tasked with the labor of both being sort of like the people that are doing the suffering and also the people that are doing the frontline care work.
Yes, beautiful. And then I just want to hear more about the ethnography. Specifically, I'm really curious about like what are people's awareness of HIV just generally? I think that would help me in understanding the chapter more. And what is like, what is their testing situation like? Are they I'm just curious what their baseline knowledge of HIV is.
Thank you, Ted. Yes, so this is based on ethnographic fieldwork from 2016 to 2018, and in Ohio, in Central Ohio and Columbus. And the kind of baseline for the conversations around HIV were about treating those directly treating those with HIV. And it was around this time that I also volunteered with the community-based health organization. So I was witnessing these conversations, and it wasn't until, around this time that the shift had been made around prevention work, right? And that was the conversation that both the local public health commissioner, and because Columbus is the state capital of Ohio, there was a lot of activity around the conversation about people living with HIV and direct services for them, that this conversation around PrEP and prevention really comes to the fore around this time because of this grant where we have PrEP navigators who are their roles and their task was to travel throughout Ohio and bring information to medical providers, people who are giving direct services to folks with this information. And at the time, nationally, there was a study, and this was years ago now, but medical people who could prescribe PrEP didn't know that that was a thing. And that was the backdrop of what was happening in this particular moment of conducting ethnography with the community-based health organization, conduct these interviews. And so I think that's shifted a bit, but I still hear from dear friends, colleagues, that my PCP, my primary care physician, doesn't know that they can prescribe this, or that, we're now at a time where there's an injectable form of PrEP, right? That I didn't actually get to here, but a lot of energy around, kind of injectable PrEP now. I also think ethnographically that part of what was happening because of the conversations with the prep navigators is that like the conversation was becoming more of a conversation because I was joining it, but also like a part of it. So in the kind of feminist science technology kind of language, right? Like I was following a pill, but in so doing, I was actually also creating and letting kind of those curiosities allow the questions to like research questions to emerge, which inevitably also meant that more people were having the conversation because I was talking about it with, you know, friends and colleagues. Like the word peer-to-peer network, I think is what some like public health organizations would describe it as. But I was also enacting it myself. Does that answer?
Yes.
Other questions? This feels like a good chance for us to invite any questions that might be in the YouTube space. If you have a question you want to throw in the chat, we are happy to receive them. Are there any other questions from the room?
I really enjoyed the kind of like case that you offered us, like this case and this idea of like being both knower and a producer of knowledge. And I think especially the question where like this kind of we're living in a world where being knowledgeable is right? And so it seems to me like this kind of like whether it's the better or the part whatever, right? That becomes kind of a space for knowledge and actually be shared, right? And so I wonder how your participants, your subjects kind of like spoke to the pleasure of teaching, right? And because to some degree, like when you think about Black and brown people, that you're kind of engaging here, we're not often thought about as knowledge producers, right? And so it seems like these are very unique spaces to actually engage with knowledge in a world where it's soluble to actually engage with.
Thank you, Jose. With regard to the pleasure in being not only a knowledge producer, but like kind of an educator. I do, so it is markedly a conversation about racialization. In fact, and again, didn't get into this too deeply, but Elias, among others, have shared with me, and I write about how PrEP was also a way for people to have sex with people of different racial and ethnic kind of backgrounds, and by that I mean Black and brown bodies saying, okay, I guess I'll have like sex with white men now, kind of really being explicit with that. And so but it wasn't framed as like a pleasure in teaching per se, but it was like it opened up who people were having sex with. If that makes sense.
It seems to some degree that it's not like you're having like critical race theory
conversations. Well, right.
Our conversations about race theory,
yeah.
Right? It's like that's kind of like the angle that I guess I'm seeing, right? That at this forum offers this kind of forum, right? Like offers this kind of space, right, to have conversations about race with white people that we don't have to have these conversations, specifically now that being outlawed. Right? You can't in Florida, you can't even choose. You're just not allowed. Right? And so like I think there's this kind of question of just like what kind of other conversations are open here, right? It is a conversation about PrEP, but it's also a conversation about, right? Like I think like you're saying, like fair competency, right, critical race theory, all these things, even though we might name them something different, and that kind of pleasurable.
Can you summarize that for our YouTube audience? Apparently, sometimes it is garbled. So sorry to like, you know, give you around like
Nick, I think is the closest to the mic.
So Jose described how PrEP is a conversation about access, but it's also a conversation about how Black and brown bodies are experience pleasure, sex, opening up the conversation that they're not using maybe the language of queer of color critique or critical race theory, but that is what is pragmatically happening in these moments that I have brought in to think with and about.
Can I sit with a maybe sort of sideways, but I'm so interested in this idea of the pleasure of teaching. And particularly when we think about like, you know, the responsibility that Black and brown bodies take on when they become sort of HIV negative, right? That like there is this sort of like both pleasure in the sort of freedoms that it allows, and also the pleasure in these moments, these sort of like chiasmatic moments where you get to do critical race theory like in the middle of a nightclub. But then I'm also thinking about like pleasure versus responsibility, right? That like the pleasure comes with this kind of like regimen of responsibility. That like part of becoming HIV negative is this like agreeing to consistently go see your doctor and agreeing to consistently participate in this sort of regime of medicalization. And then also agreeing to consistently participate in this sort of like educating, right? That like you are constantly being the advocate, you are selling the drug, you are doing the labor. And I guess I'm interested in like how you think about this tension between pleasure and responsibility, and what to do with that thing we used to call personal responsibility that feels deeply misguided in a lot of ways.
Yeah, thank you. Pleasure with responsibility. That's a subtitle. Can I use that?
Only if I'm in the acknowledgements.
You will be. So yeah, like I draw on Sarah Ahmed's work with diversity work quite a bit in this, in thinking through like, yeah, what bodies are always the kind of, for Ahmed, right, the cultural workers who are having to relay and translate information about race, ethnicity, sex, gender, and that it always falls on the Black and brown bodies and shoulders. I don't get too deeply into it because her context is emerging out of kind of education, higher education, right? And I'm talking more about kind of medicalized spaces, but also, of course, it's extending beyond just these clinical sites. But I think to your point about going on PrEP, becoming HIV negative, is a commitment to following up with your provider, because it is something that you have to have regular checkups for, whether it's quarterly or it's with the injectable form 2 months, right? That there's an entanglement or an embeddedness that like the Black and brown bodies are institutionally made a part of, but then like going out into the world. Yeah, I mean, there's something here to be said about the personal responsibility being like, is this just like personal responsibility 2.0, or is it just like a facade of kind of neoliberal or consumer markets being produced by like people who actually don't stand to benefit much from it, other than not seroconverting?
I have, well, I want to throw out the term carceral too, right? Because being forced to integrate into the medical system and sort of be surveilled by it in those ways for the rest of your life is a kind of carcerality too, right? And that specifically targets Black and brown folks. So that's, you know, I wanted to introduce that and like see what you think about that, that question. But also we have a question from our YouTube, and that is, can you talk about why being on PrEP led Elias to consider having sex with white men? Also curious about the term bareback. What does barebacking in the age of PrEP mean?
Yes, thank you, Laura, for first introducing the carceral or carcerality or surveillance, right? That there are so many points of contact between criminalization of HIV. And in fact, like, one of the people who I read and who's written about this quite extensively is Ted. And I appreciate that, right? And both at the state, well, primarily at kind of state levels, right? Criminalization of HIV. I have not explored it probably as much as I should, between the logics of carcerality and then HIV, right? In that, or those points of contact and encounter. So I appreciate that, and I'm also open to hearing in the room what folks are thinking, but certainly there is something to be said about, yeah, whether you are becoming HIV negative through going on PrEP and kind of being embedded into the medicalization of, you know, becoming medicalized in that way, or if you are living with HIV and then you're automatically a part of, you know, medicalized in that way, is worth exploring, certainly, and that is important. Elias deciding to have sex with white men was put simply based on numbers, really. Like it was about the Columbus being a primarily white and Black city. And so there were, the options were higher for Elias. And others also just described this to me about, you know, not a lot of men of color. And so oftentimes what I would find, and this happened because I was conducting some of this research and these interviews, that I would actually not get interviews from people because they knew I was doing this research, and the networks and are really small. And so it was easy for people to, you know, see each other on the weekends or to occupy certain spaces in the city. And so just pragmatically, it was going on PrEP was an easier option for Elias, among others, to open up the pool of encounters. And then barebacking in the age of PrEP, I think there is at the beginning of PrEP's introduction, there were, I'm recalling kind of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation's president talking about PrEP as like a party drug, and, you know, it being equated with, you know, the Truvada whore, which, you know, there's literature on that, and I do explore some of that in the monograph. And I think that was couched in really unfair racially coded language, right? Because it was, again, reproducing acts that were racially coded, or as a place for racially coded language. And the assumption for many people was that going on PrEP meant you weren't going to have like sex with condoms anymore. In fact, that wasn't the case. People were still using condoms, and participants that I had. But I think we're now at a point where sex or being on PrEP is synonymous with barebacking. And I think that is less of a leap to say that it isn't than even 5 years ago in a pre-pandemic world. And I would be curious to know if folks, you know, in your own encounters with PrEP would agree or disagree, or if there's, you know, information to the contrary.
I could say, sorry, I'm not gonna record myself. I've been taking PrEP since 2015, and at the beginning, I was still alert. I was a little cautious. I was like, I'm only gonna do this with people who are also on PrEP, but using protection. And then people were like, even HIV positive, if they are, you know, on treatment, they will not be transmittable. So it took me a while, because my mind was having sex unprotected with an HIV positive, it's dangerous. For years I thought that. So I didn't dare until years later. I could say maybe 5 years later. I really felt comfortable understanding it. But for a while, I was just like, no, because I as a teenager, that was the thing that was in my mind. And that was my biggest fear of anything, catching that. So.
You know what I'm gonna say.
I don't. I can't read your mind.
Can you recap just a little piece of that for the microphone, just in case people missed it?
Yes. Thank you, Fernando, for sharing and being vulnerable and sharing with us that you're, you know, been on PrEP since 2015, and that, you know, it sounds like mentally you were cautious even while you're on PrEP, and that there was a kind of internalized conversation about people who are HIV positive, even though you're on PrEP, that fear or that, kind of internal conversation about that it was also rooted in childhood probably kind of messages that you're receiving about HIV, right? As like a bad or quote dirty thing, right? And I also appreciate that you also are bringing in, the treatment as prevention, which is, people who are living with HIV who have, are taking medication and who are suppressing their viral loads, right? It's actually, impossible to transmit HIV to, anyone if you're on your medication, which is associated with the untransmittable, undetectable campaign, the UPU campaign, which is again in conversation with PrEP, right? Because these are all strategies and interventions. And yeah, equally many participants that I had were also like scared. In fact, there's one who I'm thinking of, who we'll call Daniel, who was like took all the precautions and was not actually hooking up, but was like seeking out like a primary partner in order to like have bareback sex. And it's actually difficult for me to share the story because he was one of the people who was very adamant about like wearing a condom even while on PrEP. And he eventually finds a boyfriend. And long story short, he seroconverts because he finds that he learns that they're on PrEP, they go off PrEP together, and then he seroconverts because of them deciding to be exclusive, but they weren't. And so that came later, and even I've kind of past like field work. Because it does happen, but that's not to stand in for, to produce more fears about it, but that was a concern of people. And it sounds like it remains a concern.
I think we've got time for one more question. Please.
I am really curious to hear if you've thought about COVID has illuminated, like you mentioned, about like research around transmission and race, and who can do certain things, or who needs to take certain kind of conduct.
Thank you, Damian, for the question about COVID and how that may or may not inform current, ideas about transmission and potentially like marked on certain bodies. I have thought about it, but beyond like just thinking about it, I haven't like really engaged. There are some scholars who are. In fact, there's an edited collection coming out soon that is about sex in the pandemic. That kind of explores some of these concerns. There were also a lot of parallels in light of the epidemic, in light of COVID with monkeypox. That was also really, there were a lot of points of intersecting points that I think, some investigative journalists, some like peers, some colleagues who are exploring it. And I'm just thinking about parallels with COVID in particular, like in California, where they were having kind of access to vaccines, and people were taking vouchers from like low income or poor Black communities, or and certainly there are parallels. But yeah, that's a really great invitation. Anyone have any thoughts about that?
Oh, I have so many thoughts about pandemics. I think I'm so interested in I'm so interested in medicalization and the sort of like 21st century medicalization of like specifically cis male gayness, right? That like we've landed in the moment where your options are either like PrEP or sort of like whatever are those treatments we give to like people who seroconvert, right? It's like there is this sort of like we are, I think, being conditioned to learn a kind of medicalization that like COVID in a lot of ways also helps to normalize, right? There's like there's a regime built into understanding like medicalization as a part of life, and like, you know, vaccines as a thing you might do annually. And I think like at some level there's, you know, there's a lot of fear around this, but I also think like there is an opportunity to maybe start providing the kind of global care that was a promise we never kept to begin with. And so I think it's an interesting tension, right? That sort of threatens promises to maybe go either way. And what I really find exciting about your work, right, is that it teases out like the positive potentiality, right? What might it look like if the way that this goes is something that looks like people actually becoming HIV negative, as opposed to something that might be more incendiarily like everybody becoming a customer of Gilead.
Do you want to write my conclusion?
After I write mine, and on that note, I love that we got to end this with like, you know, queer love and family.
Yes.
I've said this to you before, and I will say it again. You feel like home to me.
Oh.
It is always such a pleasure to spend time with you, to hear you think and to hear your work. It's so good. It's so good. And I'm so excited for us to be able to promote it further. And I'm so excited to see all of you again in the fall when we come back with Marshall Green on September 30th. And at Ramosa at some point in October, I'll get you a date, I promise. And Lou Cornum. And it's going to be phenomenal because they are also brilliant. And I'm so deeply excited to keep this going. So thank you so much for being with us and for being a part of this. And we are so excited to see you going forward. Much love. Solidarity. Oh my God, Bettina Aptekar and Sarah Schulman are coming for a book talk next week, which will be here in the Skylight Lounge. Not a part of this series, just a part of our Clags Read series, where we're bringing you books, Communists in Closets, which will, again, go to clags.org, sign up for our email news list, because I want to tell you more about this book, but we don't have time. So you have to come and hear the people tell you about it, because it sounds amazing. So I will see you next week, but I will also see you in the fall. And this has been such a joy.